What's up, guys? I hope you had a good weekend. It is Q&A Monday and I think this is going to be a good one. I think it's going to be a good one because there are loads of great questions from you lot. So if it turns out to be a good one, it's thanks to you. I've got them all ready on my laptop, ready to go. I've got coffee. I've got the fire on in the background, which has been a regular feature since it was installed. So it must be time to roll the sting. Right, let's start with this one from Justin Guion. There's loads to get through, so I'm going to try and smash through some of them a little bit more quickly than normal. I still want to give proper answers, I hope. I hope I'm not going to, gloss over anything that doesn't need to be glossed over, but I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. So, Justin Guion asks this one. With 43 days until the start of the season in Australia, how do the teams prepare the cars and equipment for the long trip to Australia, and what role do the mechanics play at this stage? Okay, so even slightly less than 43 days to go now. Nearly there, guys. I'm going to take, Justin, from that question that you're talking about the actual physical preparation of the cars in terms of allowing them to travel that distance, because obviously in terms of preparation of the cars they're doing everything. They're designing them, they're manufacturing them, and the mechanics are then putting them together. So I'll assume you're not talking about that bit. And in terms of getting the stuff to Australia, the teams design and make their own bespoke travel cases for most things. So small cases for each individual component. They have big containers that they make themselves and design themselves, create the inside layout themselves. All a bespoke way of laying everything out to travel, so shipping containers. But those shipping containers at the flyaway races like Australia will also double up to be office space, or perhaps little workshop spaces out the back. So once they've unpacked them, taken the cargo nets off in the paddock, you often see that, don't you, post-race when they're all coming back in on forklifts. The cargo net comes off, the cover comes off, the door opens, and then it'll be unloaded, but then they might be used, they might have shelving in there, or they might have storage in there that are used over the course of the race weekend. They might have workbenches with a vice or specialist equipment in there that can be used over the course of a race weekend. It could be the office for the spares guy. There are loads of uses for these shipping containers that the teams will load everything into for the long haul, the long travel. That's the air freight. They also, of course, use sea freight, all the teams nowadays, where they have a number of sets of sea freights of the most commonly used, like consumable items, for example, non-time specific items that they can send via sea freight much, much earlier. So the sea freight for Australia, for example, left the UK a few weeks ago, heading off down to Melbourne, stuff that's not time specific, stuff that's not necessarily, parts for the car that maybe haven't even been produced yet, but perhaps things like extension leads and cabling and the garage banner system and all of those kind of things that they have early, they have plenty of, they can send early, because it saves them a huge amount of money. So the teams will use sea freight, and when that first set has done Australia, they will then package up a next set which will be sent off to the next batch of flyaways, and the Australia set will sort of leapfrog around the world and go to another flyaway race further on down the road. So they have a few sets that kind of constantly going on a loop all around the world and will turn up at any racetrack when they need them. In terms of the cars, they travel in a pretty much assembled state. They'll have no engine in them. Some of them may not even have a gearbox in them. And actually for Australia, because it's the first race, they may be less complete than they would be at most other races, just because some parts may not be available yet until the last minute. But when the car is assembled, even if it has a spacer in place of the engine, for example, it will have a protective frame that, again, the team will design themselves and make themselves, a frame that goes around the car, just to give it some kind of protection whilst people are pushing it on and off of aircraft, pushing it around the circuit. These are often not team personnel that are moving these cars around. They could be customs officials. The steering wheel, of course, will come off and a dummy steering wheel will go on. It'll have a cover over it. And any kind of breakable parts like mirrors, if they can be removed, they'll be taken off, just to try and avoid the most basic of damage. So try and get your car there in the most complete state that it can be. Right, Ian Eva has this one. It says, I haven't thought this through, but I wonder if tyres, pit lanes maybe, and whatever else could be designed in a way that multiple strategies give the same total race time. Well, look, that's obviously the ideal scenario, isn't it? But we don't live in an ideal world, and the reason that that won't work necessarily, and it is what people are striving for, isn't it? That's why they've created tyres the way they have, why they've given Pirelli the mandate to create those tyres that degrade and last a certain amount of time. But the reason it won't work is that teams in modern Formula One are so forensic, so meticulous in their preparation and their planning and their simulation and their analysis of race strategies that they will always know that one strategy will work out quicker than another. And even if it might be by a small amount, the fact that one will undoubtedly be quicker will mean that everybody will essentially gravitate towards that. So we can try as hard as we like to try and give multiple strategies that end up with the same race time. One of the variables like temperatures, like, you know, weather conditions, like track surface, like, I mean, all sorts of different things, different variables over a race weekend contribute to strategy. And so trying to design and engineer a series of kind of rules or infrastructures that create the same you know, in terms of time options for different strategies, just simply won't work. All right, Martin Strumpfer says, Mark, does Fernando Alonso's part in his team's Daytona 24 win prove that he is just perhaps one of the most complete drivers ever? Fernando Alonso is one of the most complete drivers that I've certainly ever worked with, and I would say, you know, up there with the greats in terms of his completeness as a driver. And I say that not because he just won the Daytona 24 with his teammates. I say that because of all the things that he's done, certainly in my experience, the way that he approaches racing, the kind of the levels that he goes to get the best out of a car and out of a team. Some people will disagree with some of those levels in terms of the way that he operates within a team, how he tries to gather a team around him, sometimes at the expense of teammates or other members of that team. His Daytona 24 success comes as part of a team, not just a technical team, but also a team of drivers. It almost frustrates me a little bit how much Fernando has been in all of the headlines of that 24 Hours of Daytona race win, because as if it was just him on his own. He did that as part of a team of drivers, and driving in an endurance race is very different to driving in many other types of sprint racing. It's about being consistent, it's about being fast, but being consistent, bringing the car home, delivering exactly what you need, not much more than that, but certainly not much less than that. That's what he's very good at. But I actually think that if you'd put probably half of the Formula One grid in that seat, within that team for the Daytona 24 Hour, they could have probably achieved the same level of success. I don't think Fernando on his own brought that race win. So I don't think that contributes to his overall completeness as a driver. Certainly he's ticking the boxes, isn't he? He's ticking the boxes of winning in lots of different categories, and I think that's great. Fernando's a brilliant, brilliant driver, but let's not put too much emphasis on his recent victory within his team at the Daytona 24. Speed World asks this one, does rain actually wash rubber off a track, or does the track have less grip because the raindrops contain dust particles? I own an indoor kart track and it loses grip overnight from dust settling, not from rain. Now, interesting question this one, and this was a question that I knew in my mind. I knew that rain does wash away the rubber on a racetrack at times, but I wasn't quite sure why. I was trying to understand exactly how on earth that works. So I've looked into the numbers for you on this one. And look, to put a bit of context here, rain falling on a racetrack in light drizzle, the raindrops hit the ground at something like 5 miles per hour. Very, very light, doesn't have much of an impact. But in a storm, in heavy rain, those raindrops can be hitting the floor at 15 to 20 miles an hour. Now, I know it's only a raindrop, but that raindrop hitting the ground at 20 miles an hour can have a force of around about a Newton. Now, we all know, don't we, that 1 Newton is about the equivalent of an apple falling out of a tree, very famously. And because we know that pressure is force divided by area, now a raindrop is about, what, 2 millimetres, 2.5 millimetres in diameter. So 1 Newton over that diameter creates quite a lot of pressure. A reasonably substantial amount of pressure on that tiny little patch of ground that it hits. Now, that pressure can be enough to dislodge chunks of rubber from the tarmac. And there are a number of variables that have an impact on this. You know, how long's the rubber been there? Is it dry? Is it brittle? Is it old? How well bonded to the other layers of rubber that have gone before it is that top layer of surface rubber? What is the terrain, you know, the topography of the track itself? You know, are there bits of rubber stuck on top of peaks of the tarmac that may be easily dislodged or more easily dislodged than rubber that's perhaps buried down in a trough between peaks? So there are loads of variables, but the truth and the reality is rain can dislodge and does dislodge chunks of rubber, tiny pieces, molecules of rubber from the racetrack, which means that when it dries out and people go racing again the next day, there is less rubber on the racetrack for the tyres of a race car to adhere to, and therefore less grip. I hope that little science lesson has shed some light on that. Stuart Pocklington says, not too long ago, some F1 teams would start off a new season running the car from the previous year and only introduce a new car after a few races into the season. That doesn't seem to happen anymore. What's changed? Okay, well, that did happen on occasions, not as a rule across the board, but I know at McLaren we've done that when things have been delayed, or if we had a really good car from the year before and there were no significant rule changes, we would carry it over to allow us to delay the development program on the new car. And there's no reason that can't still happen in today's Formula One, but we have had a series of rule changes this year, or last year rather, for the 2018 season, don't forget. That couldn't happen because of the introduction to the halo. So we couldn't have put a halo onto a 2017 car because it's not just a case of bolting the halo onto the top. The whole chassis had to be designed and manufactured to accommodate the halo. So that's why we didn't see that happening at all in 2018. The rate of progress in modern Formula One is so intense that if you finish your previous season with a car that may be reasonably quick in that particular season, just the months of progress between the end of one season finishing and the new one starting means that if you start with last season's car, you're probably already a substantial chunk behind any other teams that are bringing a new car to the racetrack. So that's probably the reason. The rate of progress in Formula One has accelerated so much that you can't really afford to delay the introduction of a new car, which should, in theory, mean bringing in more performance to that car. You've got to have it for the first race, otherwise you lose valuable opportunities to collect points. James Manning says, hi Mark, could F1 go down the route of WEC and have a hybrid system driving the front wheels so we'd have four-wheel drive F1 cars? Yes, they absolutely could, James. I would love to see it, and I suspect, I mean, it's definitely been on the radar. It's something that they have looked at and have considered for 2021. It's absolutely something I can see being part of Formula One. It's an area that would give Formula One an opportunity to be road relevant, to accelerate a particular area of technical development that would be relevant to the road. So I think it's a great idea. I'd love to see it, and I suspect it's probably only a matter of time before it actually happens. Paul Gardner says, hi Mark, what are your thoughts on the renaming of Sauber to Alfa Romeo Racing? It's a shame for such an iconic name to be dropped. Well, it is a shame, isn't it? Because Sauber's been a name that's been synonymous with Formula One for as long as I can remember. It's got so much heritage, so much history. So in that sense, it's a shame to see Sauber drop off the radar. However, the important thing is that the Sauber team remain. The same people will be there, the same engineers, the same mechanics, the same marketing department, the same facilities. It is still the Sauber team, it's just that the name has changed. And on that subject, whilst we may be losing an iconic name like Sauber, we are bringing in an iconic brand like Alfa Romeo to the forefront of Grand Prix racing. So on that sense, you can see that as a positive. So for me, let's not get too hung up on names. The important thing is that the team remains. The Sauber team will still be in Formula One. They will just have sold their naming rights to another organisation. Chris Cooley asks this one. He says, what's your opinion on the future of F1 at Silverstone? I personally would be very surprised if they lost it. I'd think with the Brexit issues looming, it would be a catastrophic loss to both the economy and industry. I would also be surprised if Silverstone lost it, but this whole thing, you've got to remember, is a big game between Silverstone and the promoters of Grand Prix. You may have seen last week a statement from the Formula One Promoters Association criticising the way Liberty are running Formula One and the future direction it looks to be taking. The whole point of all of this posturing from them and from Silverstone is all essentially about getting a better deal for them. They want to renegotiate contracts. They want to do it, you know, post Bernie Ecclestone era. They want to do it in a fashion that suits them. They want a cheaper deal, essentially. And that's exactly what Silverstone want. They want to be able to come into Formula One. They want to keep Formula One, rather. But they want to do it on a grounds that allows them to make money. And you can say, well, that's absolutely fine. Of course they want to do that. They're a business. But so are Liberty. Liberty are trying to do the opposite. They're trying to squeeze as much money out of these people as possible. And the people who've signed up to these deals, whether it be Silverstone with a Bernie Ecclestone deal, they all did it knowing what they were letting themselves in for. They knew how much this was going to cost them and potentially how much they could make in return. Nothing's changed in that regard. They're all just seeing an opportunity with new owners to potentially test the water, to push back a little bit and see what they can gain for themselves out of these kind of renegotiations. So it's going to be a big game where both sides want the opposite of each other. I don't know where it'll end up. I mean, Silverstone, it's a great legacy circuit, isn't it? It's one of the most historic tracks on the calendar. But Liberty say they've got people and circuits queuing up to get a slot on their future Formula One schedule. So how much do they actually need Silverstone? Yes, they'd have a fight back from fans. They'd have a revolt from fans. But like we always do, we'd get over it as fans. And if they replaced it with a very high fee paying destination, how upset will Liberty really be? Only time will tell on that one. I hope, of course, that Silverstone manages to keep its place. Kavin Vora asks this one. He says, the F1 drivers' suit, helmet and shoes all have weight, and in F1 weight is also very important. Do these things make some difference in car performance in terms of their colours and weight? Okay, well yes it does, and there's an awful lot of time and energy and development put into the driver's clothing, helmets, safety gear, in terms of keeping the weight down. An awful lot of development. Crash helmets, you wouldn't believe. If you're a motorcyclist, if you've ever picked up a motorcyclist's crash helmet, if you then picked up a racing driver's, Formula One driver's crash helmet in your other hand, you'd be amazed at the difference of how light the F1 driver's crash helmet is for the same size and shape, essentially. The technology behind them is impressive, and it's ongoing. There's an awful lot of work. Same with suits. They've got to get the right number of layers, the right safety parameters and protection in there, but they're all looking for materials that are cutting edge and lightweight in order to do it. It's a very, very important part. Jorge says, hello, can you touch on information sharing between team drivers in terms of setup and access to telemetry, etc.? It seems Raikkonen and Bottas should be achieving better results, but this hasn't been the case since joining Mercedes and Ferrari. Okay, well, the way that teams generally share information, obviously they have debriefing sessions where they all talk to each other. So when the drivers get out of a car, you may have seen this, they all sit in the debriefing room. Lots of teams now do it with the headsets on so they can debrief in a group, not just at the racetrack, but also in communication with another group back at the factory. And they will all ask each other questions about the car. The driver will give their feedback. Both drivers will be in on that meeting, will hear the feedback from the guy on the other side of the garage as well. The data and the comments and the information that may then be put onto the system, if you like, will all be put on a shared drive that anybody within the team can access. So both drivers and engineers will have access to the data and the feedback and the comments from the other driver of the other car. So the idea behind most modern Formula One teams is that everything is open and available to each other. Of course, it has to be that way. Having said all of that, undoubtedly drivers will, knowing that everything is going to be shared on a shared drive or shared openly in these forums, will hold some stuff back, and there will absolutely be conversations that happen off the record between a driver and his engineer that he doesn't want sharing with the driver on the other side of the car. Because uniquely in Formula One, sometimes your biggest competitor is your teammate. And that's a really weird situation to have. Sometimes to gain an advantage over your competitor, your teammate, you've got to hold back information. You've got to restrict what you tell the other side of the garage. You know, it's fine if they're a Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian and Valtteri Bottas situation where Lewis has clearly got the #1 position in that team just through his performance and his results. If he doesn't see Valtteri Bottas as a threat to himself, absolutely he can share everything, because perhaps that'll help Bottas to protect Lewis against the likes of Kimi and of Sebastian. But when you've got a Nico Rosberg and a Lewis Hamilton situation where they're both battling for the world title and only each other are going to get in each other's way of getting that world title, well, that's when it becomes tricky, and that's when you start getting situations where drivers and engineers are holding information back, not putting it on the shared drive, not bringing it to this public forum or these debrief situations. It's a really difficult dynamic for a team to manage, and I still don't think anybody yet has found the perfect solution to it. Right, that's it guys, loads of questions today. I think some really good ones. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you've liked it, hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do subscribe. Thank you very much again as always, and I'll see you tomorrow.